Moscow, Soviet Union, February 14, 1978, 6:47 a.m. Valentina Dmitrievna Morozova stood in the communal kitchen of apartment block 17B on Leninsky Prospect, waiting for the kettle to boil. She wore a faded blue housecoat over her nightgown, her hair still in curlers beneath a cotton scarf. Through the frost-etched window, the sky was the color of wet concrete. She could hear her neighbors stirring, the Petrovs arguing behind thin walls, the Kuznetsov's radio crackling to life with the morning news bulletin. Ordinary sounds, ordinary morning. What made this morning different was the envelope in her pocket. Inside that envelope was a handwritten denunciation of her own son, Pyotr, age 19, a second-year student at Moscow State University. The letter detailed his possession of samizdat literature, his attendance at unofficial poetry readings, his conversations with foreign exchange students. It named dates, locations, witnesses. It recommended immediate investigation by the Committee for State Security. The signature at the bottom was hers. Within 72 hours, Pyotr would be sitting in a basement interrogation room at Lubyanka, and the trajectory of his life would be permanently altered. But the story of how a Soviet mother came to destroy her son's freedom begins not with ideology or coercion, but with something far more ordinary. Fear, shaped by systems designed to transform it into betrayal. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to the architecture of Soviet domestic surveillance in the 1970s, a period historians call the era of stagnation, a deceptive term that obscures the relentless machinery of social control operating beneath the surface calm. By 1978, the KGB had refined its methods of internal security to a level of bureaucratic precision that made mass terror unnecessary. The state no longer needed to arrest millions. It needed only to ensure that millions believed arrest was always possible. The system worked through what Soviet dissidents called prophylactic measures, a clinical term for a vast network of informants, workplace monitoring committees, neighborhood watch programs, and family pressure tactics designed to identify and neutralize ideological deviation before it could spread. The goal was not punishment, but prevention, not spectacle, but silence. And the most effective agents of this system were not professional operatives, but ordinary citizens transformed into instruments of state power through carefully calibrated incentives and fears. Valentina Dmitrievna was one of these instruments. She was born in 1939 in Smolensk, 6 months before the German invasion. Her earliest memories were of hunger and displacement, the family's evacuation to the Urals, her father's death at the front, her mother's slow starvation during the siege years. She learned early that survival meant obedience, that questioning authority was a luxury reserved for the doomed. When she married Dmitry Morozov in 1957, a junior engineer at a Moscow machine tool factory, she believed she had achieved the Soviet dream. A propiska for the capital, a room in a communal apartment, a husband with a secure position and no political complications. Pyotr was born in 1959, their only child. Valentina raised him with the same principles that had kept her alive. Keep your head down, follow the rules, trust the party. She enrolled him in the Pioneers, then the Komsomol. She made sure his school records were spotless. When he earned admission to Moscow State University in 1976 to study mathematics, she wept with pride. Her son would have opportunities she never had. He would be safe. But Pyotr had inherited something she had not anticipated: curiosity. At the university, he encountered ideas that did not appear in official textbooks. He met students who asked questions about the Prague Spring, about Solzhenitsyn, about why certain books were forbidden. In his second year, a classmate named Andrei Volkov introduced him to a circle that met in private apartments to read and discuss samizdat, self-published manuscripts that circulated hand-to-hand, typewritten copies of banned literature, poetry, political essays. Pyotr began attending these gatherings. He read Akhmatova's Requiem, Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita, essays by Sakharov. He argued with his new friends about reform, about whether the system could change from within. He was 19 years old, intellectually alive for the first time, and he made the mistake that countless Soviet citizens made. He believed that private conversations among trusted friends were safe. They were not. The KGB's Fifth Directorate, responsible for ideological counterintelligence, had been monitoring the samizdat network in Moscow universities since the early 1970s. They did not immediately arrest participants. That would have been crude and counterproductive. Instead, they mapped the networks, identified the nodes, and waited for opportunities to disrupt them through subtler means. One of their most effective tactics was to pressure family members, particularly parents, to intervene. In December 1977, Valentina received a visit at her workplace, a textile factory where she worked as a quality inspector. Two men in dark overcoats identified themselves as representatives of the Committee for State Security. They did not threaten her. They did not need to. They simply informed her that her son was associating with individuals engaged in anti-Soviet activities. They showed her photographs. Pyotr entering an apartment building on Arbat Street. Pyotr in conversation with a known dissident. They asked if she was aware of his activities. She said she was not. Then they explained her options. She could cooperate, speak with her son, report on his activities, help guide him back to the correct path. If she did this, the matter could be handled quietly. Pyotr could be redirected, his record kept clean, his future preserved. Or she could refuse, in which case the state would be forced to take official action. Pyotr would be expelled from the university, possibly arrested. His name would be entered into databases that would follow him for life. He would never work in his field. He would be marked. And there was another element they did not need to state explicitly: her husband's position, their apartment registration, her own employment. All of these were contingent on their family's political reliability. One person's deviation could contaminate the entire household. They gave her 2 weeks to consider. Valentina went home that evening and said nothing to Dmitri or Pyotr. She lay awake that night and the night after, running through scenarios. She told herself that the KGB men were exaggerating, that Pyotr was just a boy reading poetry, that this would blow over. But she had lived through enough Soviet history to know that political accusations did not blow over. She had seen what happened to families marked as unreliable. She had watched neighbors disappear, careers destroyed, children denied university admission because of a parent's file. She was 58 years old. She had spent her entire life navigating the narrow path between survival and destruction. And now the state was asking her to choose: her son's freedom or her family's security. The psychological mechanism at work here is what scholars of totalitarianism call atomization through complicity, the process by which authoritarian systems transform citizens into collaborators by making them complicit in their own oppression. The KGB did not need to torture Valentina or threaten her with prison. They simply had to activate the fear that Soviet citizens carried as a permanent condition of existence, then offer a pathway that felt like protection. Valentina convinced herself that she was protecting Pyotr. If she reported him now, before he went too far, the consequences would be minimal. He would be frightened, yes, But he would learn. He would understand the danger. He would stop, and their lives could continue. She did not consider that she was being used as an instrument of state power. She did not think of herself as an informant. She thought of herself as a mother making an impossible choice in an impossible situation. On January 9, 1978, she met again with the KGB officers. She told them what she knew: the names of Pyotr's friends, the apartment where the meetings occurred, the types of materials he had mentioned. They asked her to continue observing, to report any new developments. They gave her a contact number. They thanked her for her patriotic duty. For the next month, Valentina lived in a state of suspended dread. She watched her son at the dinner table, searching his face for signs of the danger she had reported. She listened to his conversations, cataloging details she might need to pass along. She told herself this was temporary, that once Pyotr was redirected, it would end. But surveillance systems do not work that way. Once you enter the machinery, extraction is not a matter of personal choice. In early February, the KGB officers contacted her again. They needed something more concrete: written documentation. They wanted her to compose a formal statement detailing Pyotr's activities to be placed in his file. This was standard procedure, they explained. It would create a record that justified their intervention, protected her from accusations of negligence, demonstrated her cooperation. Valentina understood what this meant. A verbal report could be denied, forgotten, reinterpreted. A written denunciation was permanent. It would exist in state archives, a document bearing her signature, her handwriting, her betrayal. She tried to refuse. She told them she had already provided information, that this was enough. They listened patiently, then reminded her of the alternative. If she would not cooperate, they would proceed with Pyotr's case through official channels: arrest, interrogation, trial. They showed her the criminal code, Article 70, anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. 7 years in labor camps. She wrote the letter. It took her 3 drafts. The first was too vague. They sent it back with notes. The second was too emotional. They wanted facts, not feelings. The third was what they needed: a clear, detailed account of her son's ideological deviation, written in the bureaucratic language of Soviet denunciation. She signed it on February 13, 1978. The next morning, standing in the communal kitchen with that envelope in her pocket, Valentina was not thinking about state security or ideological purity. She was thinking about the moment she would have to look at Pyotr across the dinner table that evening, knowing what she had done. She was thinking about whether he would ever forgive her, whether she would ever forgive herself. She delivered the letter to the KGB contact point at 9:15 a.m. Pyotr was arrested on February 16, 1978, at 11:30 p.m., as he left the apartment on Arbat Street after a samizdat reading. 4 plainclothes officers detained him on the street, searched him, confiscated the typewritten pages he was carrying. They transported him to Lubyanka for interrogation. The interrogation followed standard 5th Directorate protocols for ideological cases. The goal was not to extract confessions of espionage or sabotage. Pyotr was not accused of those crimes. The goal was to break his will, to make him understand the totality of state power, to transform him from a curious student into a compliant subject. They did not beat him. Physical torture was rarely necessary in these cases. Instead, they used psychological pressure: isolation, sleep deprivation, relentless questioning, the threat of worse consequences. They showed him his file, which contained detailed records of his activities, dates, locations, names. They showed him photographs. They told him they knew everything. Then they showed him his mother's letter. The moment Pyotr read that letter is one of the few details we know with certainty, because he later described it to friends who emigrated and gave testimony to Western researchers. He said the interrogator placed the pages in front of him without comment, let him read, then asked, "Do you understand now how serious this is? Even your own mother recognizes your mistakes." Pyotr did not speak for several minutes. When he finally looked up, the interrogator said, "She was trying to protect you. She thought if she reported you early, we would be lenient." She was right. This was the mechanism's final turn, using the mother's betrayal not as evidence of her cruelty, but as proof of the state's mercy. The message was clear. You are surrounded. Even your family cannot shield you. Your only option is submission. Pyotr was not charged under Article 70. Instead, he was expelled from Moscow State University for ideological unreliability and drafted into the Soviet Army, assigned to a construction battalion in Kazakhstan, a punishment unit for political undesirables. He served 3 years in conditions designed to break the spirit. Hard labor, minimal food, constant surveillance, no contact with former friends. Valentina and Dmitry were allowed to remain in their apartment. Her employment continued. Officially, their cooperation had been noted and appreciated. Unofficially, they were marked as a family that had required state intervention, a notation that would follow them through every subsequent interaction with Soviet bureaucracy. Valentina never spoke to Pyotr about the letter. When he returned from military service in 1981, he moved to Leningrad and cut off contact with his parents. She wrote him letters that went unanswered. She called the address she had for him. The person who answered said he no longer lived there. She tried to visit once. He refused to see her. She died in 1991, 3 months before the Soviet Union collapsed. Dmitry found a box of unsent letters in her desk after her death. Dozens of them, written over the course of a decade, explaining, apologizing, justifying. None had been mailed. Pyotr emigrated to Israel in 1993. In a 2004 interview with a Russian-language newspaper, he was asked if he had ever forgiven his mother. He said, "I understand why she did it. I understand the system that made her do it. But understanding is not the same as forgiving. She chose to survive by destroying me. That choice is hers to carry, not mine." The question that remains is not whether Valentina was a victim or a perpetrator. She was both, as were millions of Soviet citizens caught in the machinery of a system designed to turn ordinary people into instruments of their own oppression. The question is how such systems function, how they transform fear into collaboration, how they make betrayal feel like protection. The KGB's use of family members as informants was not an aberration, it was policy. Declassified documents from the Soviet archives show that the Fifth Directorate maintained extensive files on the families of suspected dissidents, mapping relationships, identifying pressure points, calculating who could be leveraged. Parents were considered particularly effective because their fear for their children's futures could be weaponized with minimal effort. The process followed a standard template: initial contact, presentation of evidence, explanation of consequences, offer of cooperation, escalation of demands. The progression was designed to create a sense of inevitability, to make the target feel that they were choosing the least harmful option when in fact they were being maneuvered into complicity. What made this system so effective was its psychological sophistication. The KGB officers who approached Valentina did not present themselves as villains. They presented themselves as pragmatists offering a solution. They did not demand betrayal. They offered protection. They did not threaten her directly. They simply described the consequences of non-cooperation. They allowed her to convince herself that she was acting in her son's best interest. This is the core mechanism of totalitarian control. The state does not need to force compliance through overt violence when it can engineer situations where compliance feels like the rational choice. The terror is not in the gulag. The terror is in the quiet conversation in the factory office, the envelope in the pocket, the signature on the denunciation. Valentina's case was not unique. Soviet archives contain thousands of similar files. Parents reporting children, children reporting parents, spouses reporting spouses. The state cultivated this culture of mutual surveillance not through mass arrests, but through the constant threat of arrest. The ever-present possibility that any deviation would be noticed, recorded, punished. The psychological cost of this system is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Survivors of Soviet domestic surveillance describe a permanent state of internal division. The part of you that wanted to trust, to speak freely, to connect with others, and the part of you that knew trust was dangerous, that speech could be weaponized, that connection created vulnerability. You learned to police yourself, to monitor your own thoughts, to betray yourself before anyone else could. Valentina lived with this division for 13 years, from the moment she wrote that letter until her death. She carried the knowledge that she had destroyed her son's future, that she had chosen her own security over his freedom, that she had become the kind of person she had once pitied and feared. And she carried it alone, because the system that had used her offered no mechanism for confession, no possibility of redemption, no language for the guilt that consumed her. The broader implications of this case extend beyond individual tragedy. Valentina's story illustrates how authoritarian systems maintain power not through spectacular violence, but through the quiet accumulation of small betrayals, each one justified by fear, each one making the next betrayal easier. The state did not need to arrest millions in the 1970s because it had already arrested the possibility of trust, the capacity for solidarity, the belief that resistance was possible. This is why totalitarianism is so difficult to resist. It does not confront you with a clear moral choice between good and evil. It confronts you with a series of impossible choices between different kinds of harm, and it makes you complicit in your own oppression by forcing you to choose. Valentina did not wake up one morning and decide to become an informant. She made a series of small decisions, each one seemingly rational in the moment, each one leading inexorably to the next, until she found herself holding an envelope that would destroy her son. The question of whether she could have chosen differently is complicated by the reality of Soviet power. If she had refused to cooperate, Pyotr would likely have been arrested anyway, and her family would have suffered additional consequences. The KGB did not need her cooperation to act against Pyotr. They had their own surveillance, their own evidence. What they needed was her complicity, her signature, her transformation from potential obstacle into active participant. This is the genius and the horror of the system. It did not need to break everyone. It only needed to break enough people, to create enough examples, to make cooperation seem inevitable. Once citizens internalized the logic of surveillance, once they began to police themselves and each other, the state could reduce its visible presence while maintaining total control. Pyotr's trajectory after his release from military service reveals the long-term damage of this system. He never returned to mathematics. He worked a series of low-level jobs: warehouse clerk, night watchman, building superintendent. Friends from his university years who later emigrated reported that he had become withdrawn, suspicious, unable to form close relationships. The interrogation and the betrayal had taught him that trust was dangerous, that intimacy created vulnerability, that the people closest to you could become instruments of your destruction. He married briefly in the mid-1980s. The marriage lasted less than a year. He had no children. When he emigrated to Israel in 1993, he went alone, carrying a single suitcase and a box of books. He found work as a bookkeeper, lived in a small apartment in Haifa, avoided the Russian émigré community. People who knew him described him as polite, competent, and profoundly isolated. In the 2004 interview, the reporter asked him if he had ever tried to understand his mother's perspective, to see the impossible situation she had faced. Pyotr's response was precise and devastating. "I have spent 26 years understanding her perspective. I understand it perfectly. I understand the fear, the pressure, the impossible choice. What I cannot understand is how understanding is supposed to erase what she did. She chose to survive by destroying me. That is a fact. Understanding the reasons does not change the fact." This exchange captures the irreducible moral complexity of life under totalitarianism. Both Valentina and Pyotr were victims of a system designed to turn human relationships into instruments of control. Both made choices constrained by fear and limited information. Both suffered consequences that extended far beyond the immediate events. And yet the harm was real, the betrayal was real, the destruction of trust was real. The Soviet state collapsed in 1991, but the psychological architecture it created did not collapse with it. Survivors carried the internalized surveillance, the reflexive distrust, the inability to believe in the possibility of solidarity. The system had taught them that everyone was potentially an informant, that intimacy was dangerous, that the state was always watching. These lessons did not disappear when the state did. Researchers studying post-Soviet societies have documented what they call the trust deficit, a persistent inability to form the kinds of social bonds necessary for democratic institutions to function. Citizens who grew up under systems that weaponized family relationships, that turned neighbors into informants, that made betrayal a survival strategy, do not easily learn to trust again. The damage is not just political, it is psychological, relational, generational. Valentina's unsent letters, found after her death, offer a glimpse into this psychological landscape. In one letter, dated 1985, she wrote, "I tell myself I saved you from something worse. I tell myself the state would have taken you anyway, that my cooperation made no difference. I tell myself these things every day. I do not believe them." In another, from 1989, "I dream sometimes that I did not write the letter that I refused, that we all suffered together, but at least we suffered honestly. Then I wake up and remember that I am not the kind of person who refuses. I am the kind of person who survives. I do not know which is worse, what I did, or that I would do it again." These letters were never sent because there was no language in Soviet society for this kind of confession, no framework for processing this kind of guilt. The state did not acknowledge that it had created impossible situations. It only acknowledged deviation and correction. Valentina could not apologize because to apologize would be to admit that she had done something wrong, and to admit that would be to question the system that had demanded her cooperation. This is the final cruelty of totalitarian systems. They do not just destroy people, they destroy the possibility of redemption. They create situations where ordinary people commit terrible acts, then deny them the language and the framework to process what they have done. The guilt becomes permanent, unresolved, a weight carried in silence until death. The case of Valentina and Pyotr Morozov is not exceptional. It is representative. Soviet archives contain thousands of similar files, each one documenting the same mechanism. Fear transformed into betrayal. Families turned into surveillance networks. Ordinary people made complicit in their own oppression. The names change. The details vary, but the pattern is consistent. What makes this case particularly instructive is the ordinariness of the actors. Valentina was not a party ideologue or a committed informant. She was a factory worker who wanted her son to be safe. Pyotr was not a dissident leader or a political radical. He was a university student who wanted to read forbidden books. The KGB officers were not sadists or fanatics. They were bureaucrats following established protocols. And yet the outcome was the destruction of a family, the breaking of a young man's spirit, the creation of guilt that could never be resolved. This is how totalitarian systems function, not through exceptional cruelty, but through the systematic application of ordinary cruelty, the transformation of normal human relationships into instruments of state power. The question that haunts this case is the question that haunts all such cases. What would you have done? It is easy, from a distance of decades and continents, to say that Valentina should have refused, that she should have protected her son regardless of the consequences. It is harder to imagine yourself at 58 years old, facing two men in dark overcoats, being told that your son's future depends on your cooperation, that your family's security hangs in the balance, that you have 2 weeks to decide. The genius of totalitarian systems is that they do not require heroes to resist them. They only require ordinary people to make ordinary choices in impossible situations. And most people, faced with such choices, choose survival. They choose to protect what they can protect, to preserve what they can preserve, to tell themselves that their cooperation makes a difference. Valentina chose survival. Pyotr paid the price. The system continued. And the question remains, how do you build a society where such choices are not necessary, where families are not turned into surveillance networks, where fear is not weaponized into betrayal? The Soviet Union is gone, but the mechanisms it perfected are not. Authoritarian systems around the world continue to use family pressure, social surveillance, and the weaponization of fear to maintain control. The technology changes. Digital surveillance replaces informant networks. Social credit systems replace party files. But the underlying logic remains the same. Make people complicit in their own oppression. Turn ordinary relationships into instruments of state power. Create situations where betrayal feels like protection. Valentina's story is a warning. This is what happens when states are allowed to penetrate the most intimate spheres of human life, when fear becomes the organizing principle of society, when survival requires betrayal. It is also a reminder. The people who operate these systems, who make these choices, who carry this guilt, are not monsters. They are ordinary people placed in impossible situations by systems designed to destroy the possibility of moral choice. In the end, the tragedy of Valentina and Pyotr Morozov is not just their tragedy. It is the tragedy of millions of Soviet families, millions of impossible choices, millions of betrayals that could never be undone or forgiven. It is the tragedy of a system that survived by making ordinary people into instruments of their own oppression, then denying them the language to understand what they had become. Pyotr Morozov still lives in Haifa. He is 74 years old. He has never married again, never had children, never returned to Russia. When asked by researchers if he would be willing to access his KGB file, now available in declassified archives, he declined. "I know what is in there," he said. "I do not need to read it again." Valentina's letters remain in a box in Dmitri's apartment in Moscow, now occupied by distant relatives who never knew her. They have never been published, never been read by anyone but the researcher who found them while conducting archival work on Soviet informant networks. They sit in that box, unsent, unread, a permanent record of guilt that could never be confessed, apology that could never be offered, love that could never overcome the fact of betrayal. The question that remains is not whether Valentina loved her son. She did. The question is what it means to love someone in a system designed to turn love into a weapon, to make care into surveillance, to transform the impulse to protect into the act of destruction. The answer is that it means living with an impossible contradiction, carrying unbearable guilt, and dying without resolution. This is what totalitarianism does. It does not just kill people, it kills the possibility of living with yourself after you have done what you had to do to survive. It creates a world where mothers betray sons, where love becomes complicity, where the choice to protect becomes the act of destruction. And it does this not through exceptional cruelty, but through the systematic application of ordinary fear, the quiet accumulation of impossible choices, the transformation of normal human relationships into instruments of state power. Valentina Dmitrievna Morozova died believing she had saved her son from something worse. Pyotr Morozov lives believing his mother destroyed him to save herself. Both are right. Both are wrong. The truth is that they were both destroyed by a system that made their destruction inevitable, that offered them impossible choices and called it freedom, that turned their love into a weapon and called it security. This is the legacy of totalitarianism. Not just the bodies in the gulags, not just the dissidents in exile, but the millions of ordinary people who made ordinary choices in impossible situations and spent the rest of their lives trying to live with what they had done. Valentina's story is their story. Her guilt is their guilt. Her impossible choice is their impossible choice. And the question that remains, the question that will always remain, is this: how do we build a world where such choices are not necessary, where families are not turned into surveillance networks, where love is not weaponized, where survival does not require betrayal? The answer is not simple, and it is not complete. But it begins with understanding how such systems function, how they transform ordinary people into instruments of oppression, how they make the unthinkable seem inevitable. Valentina's envelope, delivered on that February morning in 1978, was not an aberration. It was the system working exactly as designed. And until we understand that, until we recognize how totalitarianism operates not through exceptional cruelty, but through the systematic exploitation of ordinary fear, we will remain vulnerable to its return. The Soviet Union is gone. The KGB is gone. But the logic that turned Valentina Morozova into an informant, that broke Pyotr Morozov's spirit, that made betrayal feel like protection, that logic remains, waiting for the next system that knows how to use it, the next state that understands how to turn fear into power, the next moment when ordinary people will face impossible choices and make the decisions they will spend the rest of their lives trying to justify. This is why we remember these stories, not because they are exceptional, but because they are ordinary. Not because they are distant, but because they are close. Not because they are over, but because they are always beginning again, in every place where states claim the right to penetrate the most intimate spheres of human life, where fear becomes policy, where love becomes surveillance, where mothers are asked to choose between their sons and their survival. Valentina chose. Pyotr paid. The system continued, and the question remains.